Thanks very much, Jim. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd like to thank Ahmed Polat and Affinity International Foundation, and my friend John Cleary, who's sitting in the front row here from ABC, formerly of ABC, who introduced me to Affinity. And it's a particular delight for me to speak to Affinity because I've had quite a bit of involvement with the work of Said Nursi, and spoken a few times in Istanbul to the Nursi group there. And I'm aware in a vague way of the connection between the Rizali Nur and the person who you honor here in the form of Gulen. So it's a great honor to be involved with you for the first time, and I hope it won't be the last. And it's my task as a facilitator not to give a paper, but rather a response after our main speaker today, Professor Paul Weller, gives us his paper on religious freedom and human rights in a secular society. I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Paul Weller. He's professor at the Cultural and Legal Research Center at the University of Derby in England, and research fellow in religion and society at the University of Oxford, and director of Religion and Belief Research and Training, Ltd. Paul specializes in issues of religion and belief, state and society, and matters related to freedom of religion, belief, discrimination, and equality. He has undertaken research for a number of organizations, including the Home Office and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Until his recent retirement, he was professor of interreligious relations at the University of Derby, where he is now emeritus professor and trustee of the Multi-Faith Center. He's also fractional professor in the Center for Trust, Peace, and Social Relations at Coventry University. He's academic editor of the Journal of Dialogue Studies, director of Religion and Belief Research and Training, and an accredited trainer at Belief-O-Rama, a European initiative in religion and belief diversity and anti-discrimination training. So I'll call on Professor Weller now to address us. He'll speak for approximately 30 minutes, and then I'll do a short response, ad lib, because I've not read his paper, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So, Professor Weller.
Thank you very much for that welcome, Professor Benson, and thank you too to the Foundation for the opportunity to be here. I understand that only a few weeks ago you had another Paul Weller in Sydney, a rock star by my name out of the UK who played at the Opera House. Well, I did once upon a time play in a rock band too, but I'm sorry if I've disappointed anybody who came here today expecting something different. So, it's my task to address the topic of religious freedom and human rights in a secular society. And of course, the relationship between these terms I want to unpack, both for conceptual understanding, but also importantly for their practical import. A number of years ago, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I was at a meeting in the Council of Europe called Religion and the Integration of Migrants. Now, from a title like that, you could see already what it was that was being problematized in the meeting. First of all, integration, and secondly, religion. And it was a rather strange experience because this meeting took place, as I say, just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when there was political transformations going on in Europe, when the eastern sphere of Europe, under predominantly communist rule, was emerging into a different political system. And of course, what I thought, sitting there at the time, was why aren't we actually talking about and problematizing the concept of the secular in that meeting? Because here were half the states of Europe coming from a particular form of secular or secularism under Marxist-Leninist governments, and here were another set of West European countries that had another set of understandings of secular, And yet what we met together to problematize was religion and the integration of migrants. The term the secular was kind of invisible, or kind of assumed that everybody knew what it was and what it was referring to. So, in a sense, what I want to do today is particularly focus on the secular within this triadic relationship of religious freedom, human rights, and secular society, and its different meanings, and how, therefore, the relationship between religious freedom and human rights can play itself out according to what understanding of the secular is operative. Now, of course, it is understandable, particularly within a European historical perspective, that religion should be particularly problematized, given that one of the most important aspects of the historical development of the human rights tradition in Europe and the emergence of the secular was, of course, also the struggle for the right not to believe, or at least not to believe in the ways that dominant powers, whether civil or religious, determined that one should believe. But the complexity of the relationship between religious freedom, human rights, and the secular is compounded by the fact that neither human rights nor religious freedom, and let alone the secular, are in and of themselves self-evident or straightforward concepts. So first of all, human rights can be considered either in the general sense of terminology of the kind of body of thinking inherited from the French Revolution, liberté, equality, fraternité, or in the popular and more generalized contemporary sense of human rights as being to do with matters of equitable treatment in relation to differences of gender, race, religion, or sexual orientation, concern that I or my group has with my human rights in that kind of generalized sense of expression. But also, and importantly, of course, the term can be deployed in relation to the much more specific, limited and precise meanings of human rights found within the various instruments of international law, such as the Global Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or in Europe, the European Convention of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, or various national translations of these international or regional instruments, such as in the UK, Human Rights Act 1988. Now, from a more general philosophical perspective of the religions, there is at least some degree of tension between a way of thinking and acting that emphasizes rights in human rights and the kind of approach found historically in religious traditions that also considers the responsibilities and obligations of human beings as being of equal or sometimes perhaps greater importance than their rights. And related to this, there's also a set of questions about the emphasis on the human in human rights, or at least from a religious perspective when human rights are detached from acknowledgement of any rooting of that within the kind of ultimate or unconditioned vision that religions claim to be ultimately a necessary foundation and guarantor of the human. So there are contested understandings and meanings in relation to human rights and also at the interface between human rights and religious traditions and visions of life. There are also varied meanings and contested meanings around religious freedom. Now, in popular and political discourse, religious freedom is often used interchangeably or confused with religious toleration. But while toleration can give effect to aspects of religious freedom, from the perspective of religious groups and that of the wider civil society and polity, religious freedom has a different flavor and often a different substance to religious toleration. Religious freedom emphasizes something that's seen, perhaps on different grounds by different people, as a kind of inalienable right for people of all religions without distinction to be limited only in relation to other freedoms. But although there are different understandings of religious toleration, it tends to approach the notion of any free exercise of religion in general or by particular religions within a frame of reference that is only permissive and often proceeds by way of allowing exceptions as a way of recognizing people's religious identity and practice. So although current narratives often celebrate the development over many years and centuries of religious freedom, say in Europe, I would submit that what actually occurred, very much more, was usually the extension of religious toleration. For example, in English history, the celebrated legal byproduct of the so-called Glorious Revolution, the law known in shorthand as the Toleration Act, 1689, is actually one of those laws that needs to be understood precisely as toleration rather than religious freedom. Its full name gives the game away. An act for exempting their Majesties' Protestant subjects dissenting from the Church of England from the penalties of certain laws. So what that act produced, although it's often celebrated as an act of religious freedom, was in fact legal toleration of worship, and toleration only for Trinitarian and not Unitarian, Protestant and not Catholic, Christians, and for ministers who adhered to the 39 Articles of the Church of England, with the exception of 1 or 2 articles that were allowed specially for Baptists, rather than religious liberty for all. And in many ways, the approach of religious toleration rather than religious freedom has historically been the approach that has been found in predominantly Muslim societies. Often it's this pattern and approach which, at least in idealized forms, continues to exercise a strong influence upon significant parts of the Muslim imagination today. In such a framework, also, whether a religion or belief is a majority or a minority one is a constitutive part of that system. So, for example, in traditional Muslim majority societies, certain religious minorities, historically speaking, especially Jews and Christians, but in time also broadened to other religious communities, have been seen as having rights pertaining to their religious group, as well as obligations to the Muslim majority. This was classically formulated in the concept of dhimmis, or protected persons, in which, on the basis of accepting an overall polity determined by Muslim majority and Islam, and their being ready to pay financial tribute, these minorities were given a degree of devolved communal autonomy, within which, in terms of the classical expressions of which in the Ottoman Empire's millet system, extended to a system, for example, of separate legal courts. Now, of course, there often remained a gap between ideal and reality, with Christians and Jews often being treated by the state and the majority population as inferior members of predominantly Muslim empires. Ottoman Empire reforms officially granted Christians and Jews equality within the political community, but often those who insisted on their legal rights of emancipation were opposed or blocked. And, as we know today, the contemporary position of Middle Eastern Christian communities is also one in which, as minorities, they have often suffered considerable social and demographic pressure and consequent population attrition in the key areas of their historic geographic presence in Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and other countries where the ancient Christian churches have been struggling to maintain a social foothold. But, of course, it wasn't only Christian minorities, because in many of these contexts it's the other than majority Sunni Muslims, such as Shias, Ismailis, Alawis, Druze and others, who've sometimes been under even stronger pressure than Christians on the basis that they were more of a threat to the unity of the Ummah than religious traditions and communities that were more distinct from the family of Islam. And notwithstanding this, though, many Muslims still appeal to this traditional model, or a model of this kind, as a basis for accommodating different religious traditions in public life. Now, there is much to be said for such a tradition over and against aspects of the history of Christendom patterns exemplified by the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy, or the later pattern of the so-called "you are the religion of the country of which your ruler is the religion." And the traditional Islamic approach could be seen as having been relatively successful within the boundaries of predominantly Muslim societies in which it operated. But its weakness, among others, is that it admits of little movement or change, and it's therefore questionable how adequate it is in the context of globalized population movements and the highly mixed societies that result from migration and globalization, such as many parts, though not yet all, parts of the world today know. Now, in contrast to both this Muslim inheritance and the European historical development of religious toleration, Western so-called norms, but embodied in international human rights instruments, norms of freedom and religion or belief, have generally speaking been seen as universal, indivisible, and perhaps especially significantly as relating primarily to the individual rather than to a group. And these are the kind of norms that are embodied in contemporary international law and treaties, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to freedom, thought, conscience, and religion includes the freedom to change, the freedom either alone or in community with others to manifest religion or belief, or in the European Convention of Human Rights, similarly stated, with that freedom to manifest one's religion or belief being subject only to specified limitations, and that limitation being in particular context and needing justification. So the basic principle is that of liberty and freedom, and not only in the mind, in the conscience, but also the manifestation of it, unless there is good ground articulated why that should not be so. Now, of course, historically, many religious groups have actually been resistant to the emergence of religious freedom, or at least for groups other than themselves, either within their overall tradition or in relation to those of other religions. And many have then only grudgingly or perhaps pragmatically eventually come to accept an approach to religious diversity based more on toleration than on religious freedom. But there have been some religious traditions that have always upheld a commitment to religious freedom, understood not merely as a concession to social and political change, but as a principle, a theological principle, rooted in a particular understanding of the nature of the human and of the divine and the relationship between them. Thus, within the Christian tradition from which I come, for example, the so-called Baptist Christian tradition, there has been a long strand that has articulated religious freedom, not toleration, but freedom based in a theological understanding of the relationship between human beings and God, and how that manifests itself in community. So the 17th century Thomas Helwys, in the book pamphlet The Mystery of Iniquity, written to King James I and addressed to him, "Our Lord the King is but an earthly king. He has no authority as a king except in earthly courses." So man's religion is to God, betwixt God and themselves. The king shall not answer for it, neither may the king be judge between God and man. Then he went on in the language of the time, let them be heretics, Turks, that meant in the language of the time Muslims, Jews or whatsoever. It appertains not to the earthly power to punish them in the least measure. So it was a very early statement of advocacy of not just toleration, but religious freedom. The fact that it also included in its remit other forms of Christian was in fact in that time and place even more remarkable, because generally speaking, Baptist advocates for religious freedom included religious freedom for Roman Catholic Christians, which, just like the flip side in Muslim majority societies, where sometimes those who are part of other than Sunni Muslim groups become more under pressure than those completely outside the household of Islam, in this particular period in England, Protestant Christians were afraid, sometimes with reason, sometimes not, of what a resurgent Catholicism might do in terms of their own religious liberties in the future. And yet this vision from within this particular strand of the Christian tradition embraced all of these things and did not distinguish between different groups, because it wasn't a matter of tolerating, it was a matter of articulating religious freedom as a theological principle. Now, having focused so far on religious freedom and on human rights, what about the secular? What about this missing kind of thing that people pass over so quickly when they talk about these other concepts? So I want to focus our attention on that triad. What is this often silent, albeit being present and remaining unarticulated dimension of the in-between when the relationships between religious freedom and human rights are discussed? It's often argued it's been the rise of the secular spirit and its adoption by states and societies that has enabled some degree of religious coexistence to overcome the inheritance of religious absolutism. And one can understand that against the historical background of reaction to the horror of the European wars of religion, the inheritance of the Inquisition, and the impact of these things on wider social and religious life. But in considering the secular, we come to the critically important point that rather like those concepts of religious freedom and human rights, it is not a singular concept. It appears in various forms. So, one version of this that sets out different forms from an African author in the study of religion argues that a secular state is one where one or a combination of the following is prevalent. So this is just for kind of example and thinking about it. It could be a state where religion is suppressed. It could be a state where religion is not given official recognition. It could be a state where government is neutral in matters of religion, where there is freedom of worship, where no religion is imposed on people, or where there's no state religion, where advancing science and technology have limited the sphere of influence of religion, where there's a waning of institutional religion, or fewer people attend religious services, or where there's a separation of religious from political, legal, economic, and other institutions. Now, of course, there are many variants, and I'm just going to focus, for the sake of simplification and having a debate and argument with you, afterwards opening up a discussion, three kind of main patterns which can be associated with different parts of the world. First of all, what are called separation of religion and state with religiosity, then what are called the secularist secular tradition, and then the tradition of the secular against the communal. So separation of religion and state with religiosity, in many ways, is the kind of tradition that one finds in the United States of America, with its constitutional guarantee now of religious freedom and the separation between religion and state. And yet, although that is formally articulated in that way, and it's been through a long process of evolution, it wasn't there at the beginning of the American Confederation. The Articles of Confederation didn't require particular things. It came as the First Amendment of the Constitution. But what actually happened here is that although this very clear in many ways, but is it so clear? Because sometimes in the legal tradition what's emphasized is separation, and sometimes what's emphasized is free exercise, and the debate between these two go from one to the other over the years in different Supreme Court and other court decisions. But of course, alongside all of this in the USA, one of the paradoxes is that alongside these basic principles, courtroom oaths and swearing in are also found with religious elements. The national holidays of Thanksgiving and Memorial Day, the rituals associated with the American flag, the Pledge of Allegiance to a Nation Under God, the national motto of In God We Trust, the investitures of presidents who often appeal to God language in a way that's unusual among European politicians, So there is constitutional separation between particular religions and the state that is not based on an ideology of what one might call secularism, but the religiosity of civil society is an important part of public and political culture. The second broad family of models of secular state is what I've called the secularist secular tradition. Now, to some extent, both as in the American tradition, and remember, of course, those who founded America in the sense that we know it today, those who migrated, not those who were there for thousands of years before, but those who migrated from Europe were often migrating precisely in order to find religious freedom from constrictive and repressive rules at home. The second tradition, secularist secular tradition, was also in a way a reactive development found particularly in the French revolutionary republican tradition of secularism. It was a protest against a nationalized monopoly form of a relationship between religion, state, and society. In many ways in France it was linked with an anti-clericalism as well that was very strongly imbued in French society post-revolutionary France. And taken together, these values give rise to the strong French tradition of what they call laïcité, a word that can't really be fully or easily be translated directly into the word secular. But French Republican society politics has traditionally been organized on the basis of a strong conviction that religion is a matter for the private sphere, and therefore opposed to possible contamination of the public sphere by religion. Hence, the adoption by the French state of restrictions on the wearing of religious symbols in public schools, including headscarves for Muslim girls, kippahs for Jewish boys, and crucifixes among Christian young people. There are exceptions in France. The Département of Alsace-Lorraine, for example, still has Germanic tradition there, and it's a bit different. But this tradition was also precisely the tradition that in many ways evolved through the socialist and Marxist traditions of Europe and found its expression in Marxism-Leninism and its approach to religion and society, and indeed in Turkish society to what a number of authors looking at this topic in relation to Turkey have called a radical Jacobin laicism that has been inherited from the French revolutionary tradition and informed the Kemalist tradition in the Republic of Turkey. There is, however, also then another broad tradition, which I've called the secular against the communal, because outside of the Northern Hemisphere, the notion of the secular can be found in other modes. So, for example, in the history and constitutional tradition of the Republic of India, this means something different. The secular nature of the independent state of India was not seen as being fundamentally opposed to religion. It was understood and argued to be a defense against the threats posed to the nascent republic by what one could call religious communalism. The term communalism was first used by British colonists to describe the situation in colonies such as India and Malaysia, where religious and ethnic minorities existed alongside majority groups, and where, in order to divide and rule, the colonists played the communal card of highlighting religious differences. And of course, at the birth of the state of India, there were terrible communal violence and riots, killings, which have from time to time re-emerged also over the decades since then. So secular in India means, historically, standing against not the involvement of religion in public life, but against the communalization of religion and its impact on public life. And to give an expression by a political scientist in India called Achin Vanig, and those of you at the session last night and heard me speak will have heard me quote this here, quote that briefly there. what he says in relation to the relationship between religion and politics, he says, people often say that to say politics and religion should be kept separate is understandable, especially at a time like ours. But what it really means is that politicians should not use religions for short-term political ends, and religious leaders should not use politicians for narrowly communal gains. Because every religion, he says, has a social and public dimension. To say that religion should be a private affair is to misunderstand both religions and politics. That politicians should not use religions for short-term political ends, and religious leaders should not use politicians for narrowly communal gains. So I think that if we don't simply accept the invisibility or the non-discussability of the term of the secular, when we look at the relationship between religious freedom and human rights, we can see that different models, different understandings, both theoretical and practically worked out constitutionally and then practically worked out into public life, show the importance of how the lens on secular affects very much the debate between religion and human rights. From within the Christian tradition, I've tried to indicate that I believe there are resources that can help Christianity, in an ecumenical sense, to develop and within the Christian community have a better understanding of how it might deal with this threefold relationship. From within Islam, it's my conviction that perhaps one of the greatest gifts to the future of Muslims and of Islam in the world is that the Turkish Muslim scholar Fethullah Gülen takes a very different approach to these questions, from either glorifying the Ottoman past or, like political Islamists, advocating a form of religious Leninism by which the capture of the instruments of the state should deliver the vision of Islam in society. Rather, Fethullah Gülen states, Islam does not need the state to survive. In a way, not the state, but rather community is needed. Indeed, he goes further and warns politicizing religion would be more dangerous for religion than for the regime, for such people want to make politics a means for all their ends. Religion would grow dark within them, and they would say, we are the representatives of religion. This is a dangerous matter. So in a conference paper in conclusion that I delivered around a decade ago at Georgetown University on religious freedom in the Baptist vision and in Fethullah Gülen, Resources for Muslims and Christians, I wrote the following with which I'd like to conclude. Within Islam, the teaching of Fethullah Gülen and the practice of the movement that looks to inspiration for his teaching has emerged out of a clash within Turkish history between a radical and often anti-religious form of secularism and obscurantist and or oppositionalist forms of being Muslim. It draws on the best elements of the Ottoman Turkish inheritance with regard to toleration, but it has also issued into a global vision of Islamic integrity in its commitment to religious freedom that is deeply rooted in the Quran and the Sunnah, while being fully and dialogically engaged with the plurality of the contemporary world. And it's such a vision that lies behind the activities of organizations such as Affinity, as a part of whose program we meet today, and in which it's therefore been, for me, a privilege to take part, and thank you.